Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and welcome to The Other Side of History. In this third talk, I would like to continue our history of early Christianity. And I also want to get into this fabulous book that I have been talking about, Truth Triumphant, and it's by B.G. Wilkinson. The Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia reveals some interesting details about who the man B.G. Wilkinson was and his career. He was trained for the ministry at Battle Creek College. He then became an evangelist in Wisconsin, and he obtained a B.A. at the University of Michigan, and then returned to Battle Creek College as a dean. After a short spell as president of the Canadian Conference, he became the dean of theology at Union College. He is credited with commencing the Seventh-day Adventist work in Rome, Paris, and in Spain, having spent 4 years as president of the Latin Conference in the Southern European Division. Returning to North America, we find him as evangelist, dean of theology at Washington Missionary College, and president of Washington Missionary College until 1945. According to a friend of the Wilkinsons family, B.G. Wilkinson's ability as a scholar and researcher, it came into the notice of Cordell Hull. He was then the U.S. Secretary of State. And this man, he supplied Wilkinson with credentials which virtually unlocked to him the whole vaults of the world. And it enabled him to examine rare historical documents and manuscripts. B.G. Wilkinson really was a kind of genius. He spoke and wrote in 8 languages fluently. He knew all of the biblical languages. He even knew Syrian. Truly, God used this man in a very remarkable way. Now, what I want to share with you is the amazing history that's found in his book, Truth Triumphant. And, I really believe it's a providential book. Just as the Bible speaks of this mystery of iniquity that has continued all down through the ages, God's true church has also continued down through the corridors of history. The spread of early Christianity was broad. Christians were spreading their doctrines and distributing their books into Persia, India, Tibet, China, and Africa, just to name a few places. After the martyrdom of Stephen, the apostle James and brother of John, he was martyred. Thomas, he preached to the Parthians and the Medes and Persians and others. He was actually martyred in India, being slain with a dart. Mark, he preached the gospel in Egypt, and there was drawn with ropes into a fire and burnt. Andrew and Simon, they were crucified, as was Christ. Matthew, after converting Ethiopia and Egypt to Christianity, he was run through with a spear. The Apostle Paul, after his time there in Rome, actually this is while he was in Rome, he was let out of the city and he gave his neck to the sword. John the Revelator, he was put into a cauldron of boiling oil. However, they were not able to kill him. By a miracle of God, he was preserved. Now, many of the emperors, they were persecutors of God's people. The Emperor Caligula, who came after Tiberius, he was a very bloodthirsty tyrant. Finally, a tribune, with the help of another person, they slew Caligula in the 4th year of his reign. After his death, it was found that he had 2 small books in his closet. One was called the sword, and the other was called the dagger. Now, in these books were contained all the senators and the noblemen of Rome, and he had determined to put them to death. A coffer was also found where there were diverse kinds of poisons that were kept in glasses and in vessels for the purpose of destroying a great number of people. Anyhow, these poisons, they were thrown into the sea and they destroyed a great number of fish. The church in the wilderness is the connecting link between the apostolic Christianity and God's people today. Now, In Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, it says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." So here is the scripture that speaks of this 1260-year prophecy. Now, during this long time period, which was from 538 to 1798, there were true Christian people that were in every country. They possessed churches and colleges, mission stations, and theological schools. They followed closely and they adhered steadfastly to the beliefs and the practices that had been delivered to them by the apostles and saints. They also possessed and they preserved the original scriptures that had been given there in the first century. Now, at times, these Christians who belonged to this church in the wilderness, they had many churches, famous schools, and distant mission stations. But then other times they suffered much from poverty and persecution. Our history from this book, Truth Triumphant, is going to introduce you to these people from this church in the wilderness time period. There are modern authors who try to belittle the American founders of religious liberty and democracy. Men like Washington, Jefferson, and others. Now, this same class of writers, they've invaded the realm of church history. Much of history has been destroyed and rewritten. And today, what has been obscure before in history, it's growing even darker. And that's why this book, Truth Triumphant, it truly is a light in the darkness. In the last talk that we did, I had mentioned Lucian of Antioch, who lived from 250 to 312 AD. Now, Lucian can be compared with the founders of the American Republic. Just as the authors of the American Declaration of Independence and that part of the Constitution that we know as the Bill of Rights, it gave to this nation documents upon which to build a state. So, Lucian, in this hour when there was this documentary confusion that was threatening chaos, he defended and he preserved and passed on to other generations the true text of the Holy Scriptures. Now, Antioch, Syria, at that time, when Lucian was alive, it was a center of Grecian life and culture. In his day, Rome ruled supreme, and there was not a more powerful metropolis actually than Antioch, Syria. On the outskirts, there was a glamorous grove, and it was celebrated above all other groves. The pleasure seeker was able to find many delights there, ranging from the most luxurious and sensuous to the highest performances in classical art. Now, in his youth, Lucian, he looked upon these scenes of worldly folly, but his pious heart, he turned away from them in a complete devotion to God. Lucian quickly discerned that there were two movements that were taking place within Christendom. Now, one was loose in doctrine, and it was affiliating itself with heathenism. The other was based on the deep foundations of a true Christian faith. Paul and Barnabas, they had raised up churches there in Syria, and they lay directly north of Decapolis. Now, Decapolis actually is a word that means 10 cities, and these cities had special citizenship rights. Rome, they lavished huge sums of money actually to beautify and embellish these cities with Grecian culture and philosophy. And they did this in a hope of leading the Jews that had settled there into pagan art and thought. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, there was about 100 cities there in Syria, which today are actually known as the Silent Cities. Now, in these cities, many of the early Christians settled. And we're actually going to speak more about these silent cities, but we're going to do it in another talk. So now remember, during this time that Lucian lived, there were these two main schools. There was the school there at Antioch, Syria, which Lucian belonged to. And it was leading a revolt against this combining of Christianity with paganism, heathenism. Then there was the school there in Alexandria, Egypt, where it was very popular to mix Christianity with pagan thought. However, what Lucian did, and it was definitely by God's grace, he developed a system of theology that was so real that although there were many attacks against it, it prevails even to this day. Lucian was a very learned man. And as we said in the last talk, it was actually Lucian who did work on the New Testament, which today we know as the received text. But Lucian also did work on the Old Testament from the original Hebrew, and it actually soon became famous. He was an excellent Hebrew scholar, and his version was adopted by the greater number of the churches that were there in Syria and Asia Minor. In Alexandria, Egypt, there was this teaching that was popular, and it was the no-law theory. Lucian, he took a stand against this, and he taught in his school there at Antioch, Syria, that there was a binding obligation to the Ten Commandments. His enemies called him a Judaizer in this desperate attempt to discredit him. Also, when excommunication was pronounced upon all of the churches there in the East, who would not make Easter always come on Sunday, Lucian, he opposed this Alexandrian policy. Lucian was actually bitterly hated there at the school in Alexandria. And yet, historians, they recognize their inability to account him of any factionalism or instability. There is no record of any charge of heresy, officially or ecclesiastically, that was lodged against him by his contemporaries. Another difference in doctrine between the school there at Antioch, Syria, and the school at Alexandria, Egypt, it was over the nature of Christ. Theologians of the Antioch school, they emphasized both the divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ. But at the Alexandrian school, they only were emphasizing his divinity. One bishop who sided with the Church of the East, and his name was Athanasius, he said, if Christ were not one with the Father, then salvation could not be possible. And if Christ was not fully man, then human nature could not be saved. There was another bishop who argued against this Alexandrian thought, and his name was Nestorius. He was actually the bishop there at Constantinople. He protested against the title God-bearer or Mother of God in the way that the Alexandrian school was interpreting it. He said Mary was the mother of Christ only in his humanity. Nestorius, he was disposed of. They got rid of him, and they sent him actually to Antioch. And he was no longer Bishop of Constantinople. They labeled him as a heretic. Arius was also called a heretic. Now, he's the one who supposedly created the theory that Christ was a created being. You may have heard of Arianism. Well, the historian Philippus Limbach, he doubts that Arius himself ever held to this theory that Christ was created instead of being begotten. It seems that perhaps this whole created being theory was a way to demonize Arius and to make him out to be something that he was not. When the Portuguese, they first opened the navigation to India, the Christians there at St. Thomas, they found this title, Mother of God, offensive to their ears. They saw how the Latins exalted her to the rank of a goddess. When her image was first presented to the Christians there at St. Thomas, they indignantly exclaimed, "We are Christians, not idolaters." True Christianity, along with the purity of the scriptures, it has never been destroyed. Lucian's influence was felt down through the Dark Ages. In 312, Lucian, he died, actually a martyr's death. But they could not destroy his pure edition of the Holy Scriptures. The Waldenses, they passed along Lucian's scripture and doctrines to the Reformers, and today there still are people who hold to these truths. Psalms chapter 11 verse 3 says, "If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do?" I believe that it is our duty to know what the foundations of our faith really are. And who is it in the past who has stood as defenders of this faith? So if you have liked this talk, I would like to just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. And I just want to thank you for listening, and God bless.